began with an email that arrived in Sarah Collins' inbox on an unremarkable Monday morning. As a seasoned true crime podcaster, Sarah was used to receiving strange messages, tips about unsolved murders, and fan theories about infamous cases. But this one was different. The subject line read, "Help me, he's not who you think he is." Intrigued, she clicked it open, expecting the usual ramblings of an overzealous amateur sleuth. Instead, she found a concise yet chilling plea from someone who claimed to be Claire Reynolds, the wife of Michael Reynolds, one of the most notorious serial killers of the decade. Michael Reynolds had been convicted 7 years ago for a series of brutal murders that had terrorized the small town of Fairview and its surrounding areas. His trial had been a media circus, his guilt seemingly undeniable. The evidence had been damning: DNA at the crime scenes, a journal detailing dark fantasies, and even a partial confession during police interrogation. The public had branded him a monster, and the case was considered closed. Yet, Claire's message now threatened to unravel the narrative that had been accepted for years. In her email, Claire wrote that she had uncovered evidence suggesting Michael wasn't the person behind the murders. Her tone was desperate, yet calculated, as though she had carefully weighed the risks of reaching out. She claimed she had been living in silence for years, too scared to speak up but unable to carry the burden of the truth any longer. She begged Sarah to listen, to help her uncover what really happened. "I know this sounds unbelievable," Claire wrote, "but Michael didn't kill those people. He was set up, and I think the person who did it is still out there." Sarah hesitated. Over the years, she had learned to approach every tip with a heavy dose of skepticism. False leads and outlandish theories were part of the job. But something about Claire's message struck a chord. Maybe it was the vulnerability in her words, or the sheer audacity of claiming innocence for a man the world had long condemned. Or perhaps it was the faint possibility that Claire was telling the truth. If Michael Reynolds was innocent, it meant the real killer had walked free for years, possibly still hunting for their next victim. The email included an attachment, a scan of what Claire said was Michael's journal, the same one used to convict him. But this version was different. It had entries that never made it to court, entries that painted a picture of a man preoccupied with mundane worries, work, deadlines, his wife's health, the struggle to repair their crumbling marriage. Most strikingly, Claire pointed out an entry that placed Michael in another city on the night of one of the murders. If the journal was authentic, it could cast doubt on the timeline that had secured his conviction. Sarah's curiosity got the better of her. She couldn't ignore the possibility, no matter how slim, that an innocent man had been wrongly imprisoned. Against her better judgment, she decided to reply to Claire's email, setting in motion a chain of events that would change everything she thought she knew about truth, justice, and the human capacity for deception. Claire's response came quickly after Sarah decided to reach out. Along with a heartfelt thank you for listening, she sent a series of scanned pages from Michael's journal. These pages, Claire claimed, had never been shown in court, yet they were crucial to understanding the truth. Sarah opened the files and immediately felt a wave of unease. The journal was not what she expected. Rather than ramblings or confessions of a killer, the entries seemed ordinary, almost painfully mundane. Michael wrote about his struggles at work, frustrations with his boss, and efforts to save his strained marriage. He detailed dinners he cooked for Claire, movies they watched together, and even his plans to adopt a dog. It painted a picture of a man consumed by everyday worries, not someone harboring dark secrets. But what caught Sarah's attention most was an entry dated the night of one of the murders. According to Michael's journal, he had been attending a work conference in another city, hours away from the crime scene. He even mentioned specific details about the event: a keynote speaker, a poorly catered dinner, and the hotel where he stayed. Claire claimed this alibi had been ignored during the investigation and trial. Sarah compared the journal entry with the court records. The prosecution had successfully argued that Michael was in town that night, using phone records to suggest he had been near the crime scene. Yet there was no hard evidence placing him there. The journal presented an unsettling contradiction. If it were authentic, It meant Michael couldn't have committed the crime that night. As Sarah delved deeper into the journal, she noticed a recurring theme. Michael often wrote about feeling watched, even paranoid. In one entry, he described seeing the same car parked outside his house multiple times. In another, he mentioned receiving anonymous letters in the mail, though he dismissed them as pranks. At the time, it seemed trivial, but now, with the context of Claire's plea, Sarah wondered if these incidents held a darker significance. The most chilling discovery came in the final pages of the journal. There, in shaky handwriting, was a list of names. Some were familiar, they belonged to the 7 confirmed victims attributed to Michael, but others were unfamiliar, unconnected to any crimes Sarah knew of. Stranger still, some names were crossed out, while others remained untouched. Claire insisted Michael hadn't written this list, claiming it was added to the journal after his arrest. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this journal was a key piece of evidence, one that had been overlooked or intentionally buried. But why? Was it possible that someone had tampered with it to frame Michael? Or worse, could it be that Michael had written it and was revealing his future plans before he was caught? The more Sarah studied the journal, the more questions it raised. Was it an overlooked artifact of a flawed investigation, or was it a carefully planted tool in a larger, more sinister scheme? The answers remained elusive, but one thing was clear: this case was far from over. Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Michael's journal was more than it appeared to be. It seemed impossible that something so significant had been ignored during the trial. Determined to uncover the truth, she began re-examining the original case. She started with the police reports, trial transcripts, and media coverage from the time. The more she read, the more inconsistencies she discovered. The first red flag was the lack of physical evidence tying Michael to the crime scenes. Although prosecutors relied heavily on his journal and circumstantial evidence, forensic details were surprisingly thin. The murder weapon, a knife, had no fingerprints, something the prosecution had dismissed by suggesting Michael wore gloves. However, this seemed unusual for someone allegedly acting impulsively. Furthermore, there were no traces of Michael's DNA on any of the victims, despite claims that the murders were brutal and personal. Then there was the timeline. Sarah noticed that the prosecution had used vague cell phone data to argue that Michael was near the crime scenes at the time of the murders. Yet the data didn't pinpoint his exact location. It only suggested he was in the general area. Coupled with the fact that Michael's journal indicated he was in another city on one occasion, the timeline began to crumble under scrutiny. As Sarah dug deeper, she uncovered something even more disturbing. A retired detective who had worked on the case mentioned an anonymous tipster who had provided key information during the investigation. This tipster, whose identity was never revealed, had guided police to Michael as their primary suspect. The tipster had claimed to have overheard Michael talking about the murders and had even pointed them toward Michael's journal. At the time, the tip seemed credible enough to pursue, but the detective admitted there was no solid evidence linking the caller to the case. Sarah also discovered a detail buried in the trial transcripts that hadn't received much attention. A single piece of surveillance footage from one of the crime scenes had been presented during the trial. The footage, taken from a nearby gas station, showed a man entering the area just minutes before the murder. Prosecutors claimed it was Michael, but the footage was grainy and inconclusive. Sarah managed to track down a copy of the footage and studied it carefully. The man in the video had similar features to Michael but appeared slightly taller and heavier. It was enough to cast doubt on the identification, but not enough to prove Michael's innocence. Claire, desperate to provide more context, shared one final revelation with Sarah. She had found an old Vosh tape hidden in their attic, which she believed contained footage from their home security system. Claire claimed she didn't know who had placed it there or why it was hidden, but when Sarah viewed the tape, it showed something horrifying. The video captured a man lurking outside Michael and Claire's home weeks before the first murder. His face was obscured, but he didn't resemble Michael. The mounting evidence began to suggest a new, chilling possibility. What if someone had been watching Michael and Claire for months, setting Michael up as the perfect scapegoat? Sarah's mind raced with questions. Who was the man in the footage? Was he connected to the anonymous tipster? And if Michael was innocent, how many more victims had been claimed by the true killer while Michael sat behind bars? The deeper Sarah delved into the case, the more unsettling her findings became. Her research had painted a picture of a flawed investigation, one marred by unanswered questions and overlooked details. But her focus soon shifted to a new lead, Daniel Harper, Michael's childhood friend. Daniel had played a pivotal role in the trial, testifying that Michael had confessed to the murders during a drunken conversation. His testimony had been one of the prosecution's strongest pieces of evidence, swaying the jury toward a guilty verdict. Sarah couldn't ignore the strange coincidences surrounding Daniel's involvement. He and Michael had been close for years but had a falling out shortly before the murders began. Court records revealed that Daniel had approached the police shortly after the first body was discovered, claiming to be concerned about Michael's behavior. He painted a picture of a man unraveling, describing Michael as erratic and volatile. But Sarah couldn't find any corroborating evidence to support Daniel's claims. A closer look at Daniel's financial history revealed something even more suspicious. Bank statements showed several large deposits made into his account shortly after Michael's arrest. The amounts were too significant to ignore, and the sources were listed as private entities with no clear connections. Sarah began to suspect that Daniel might have been paid to implicate Michael, but by whom and why? Her investigation took another dark turn when she uncovered a link between Daniel and a man named Victor Lang, a wealthy businessman who had quietly purchased properties near several of the crime scenes. Victor was a name that had appeared in Michael's journal on the untouched list of names, but at the time, it had meant nothing to Sarah. Now it stood out like a glaring clue. Victor Lang was an elusive figure, known for his influence in the community but rarely seen in public. Rumors swirled about his involvement in illegal activities, but nothing had ever been proven. Sarah discovered that Victor and Daniel had been business partners years ago, running a small construction firm before Victor amassed his fortune. Their connection was undeniable, yet it had never been mentioned during the trial. The more Sarah uncovered about Victor, the darker his shadow loomed over the case. Several of his properties had been located within walking distance of where the victims' bodies were found. One property in particular had been sold shortly after Michael's conviction, raising questions about its significance. Sarah began to suspect that Victor had used his wealth and power to orchestrate the murders, with Daniel acting as his accomplice. But why frame Michael? The answer seemed to lie in his past. Michael had briefly worked for Daniel and Victor during their construction days, a fact that hadn't been highlighted during the trial. Sarah theorized that Michael had stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see, perhaps evidence of criminal activity, and had become a liability. Framing him for the murders not only eliminated him as a threat, but also provided a convenient scapegoat for their crimes. Sarah was beginning to connect the pieces of a sinister puzzle. It was no longer just about Michael's innocence. The evidence pointed to a far-reaching conspiracy involving Daniel, Victor, and possibly others, a network of manipulation and murder designed to stay hidden in plain sight. But as Sarah uncovered more, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, just as they had watched Michael all those years ago. Sarah knew she was getting closer to uncovering the truth, but with every step forward, the danger seemed to grow. Her investigation into Daniel Harper and Victor Lang had revealed a web of lies and corruption, but solid proof remained elusive. She compiled everything she had: bank records, the journal, the surveillance footage, and property records, but the pieces, while damning, weren't enough to conclusively prove Michael's innocence or implicate Daniel and Victor. Then, just as Sarah began preparing to release her findings to the public, she received a chilling email from Claire. The subject line read, "Stop, they're watching me." The message itself was brief, but its tone was filled with fear. Claire wrote that she had noticed an unfamiliar car parked outside her house for days and that she felt like someone was following her. She pleaded with Sarah to be careful, warning that whoever was behind the murders wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. Hours later, Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. News broke that Claire Reynolds had been found dead in her home, an apparent suicide. Authorities claimed she had left a note confessing to aiding Michael in his crimes, but Sarah couldn't believe it. Claire had been terrified but determined to uncover the truth. Suicide didn't fit, and the supposed confession felt too convenient. It was clear to Sarah that Claire had been silenced, her death staged to protect whoever was truly responsible. Shaken but resolute, Sarah decided to push forward. She published a detailed expose online outlining all the evidence she had gathered. The article went viral within hours, reigniting public interest in Michael Reynolds' case. People began questioning the original investigation and pressure mounted for authorities to reopen the case. Yet, as the story gained traction, Sarah found herself living in constant fear. She started noticing subtle signs that she, too, was being watched, a car idling outside her apartment, strange calls with no one on the other end, and the feeling of being followed whenever she left her home. Days later, Sarah received a package at her office. It had no return address and contained a single item, a blood-stained glove. Accompanying it was a note scrawled in shaky handwriting that read, "You're next." Sarah immediately turned the evidence over to the police, but the message was clear. Whoever had orchestrated this was warning her to stop. Despite the threat, Sarah's expose led to the reopening of Michael's case. The new investigation revealed further irregularities, including mishandled evidence and a rushed prosecution. But no charges were filed against Daniel Harper or Victor Lang. Both men disappeared from public view shortly after the story broke, leaving behind only questions. Michael remained in prison, his conviction under review but not yet overturned. The case, once thought closed, was now shrouded in even greater mystery. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the true killer or killers were still out there, free to strike again. The story ended without closure, leaving viewers haunted by the possibility that justice had yet to be served.